There are cables.
We're grateful to Dr. Michael Lamb and Dr. Kathy Lamb for sponsoring this series and for suggesting that we invite Professor Ian Hutchinson. So the Lambs underwrite this lecture because they want to show there's no contradiction between science and faith. So the question is Professor Hutchinson a person of science and a person of faith? Well, first of all, we'll deal with science. Dr. Ian H. Hutchinson is Professor Emeritus of Nuclear Science and Engineering at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Hutchinson has published 250 articles and multiple books. His primary research interest is plasma physics, especially the magnetic confinement of plasmas. He's seeking to enable fusion reactions, which is the energy source of stars. He conducted the first direct measurement of anomalous resistivity during MHD disruptions and of hollow current profiles during the current rise, and the first observations of polarized tokamak electron cyclotron radiation, and the development of diagnostics of thermal and non-thermal electron distributions based on. I was a physics major. I have no idea what that means, but doesn't it sound impressive? You should be
TMI.
Dr. Hutchinson is a fellow of the American Physical Society, a fellow of the Institute of Physics. He was chair of the American Physical Society Division of Plasma Physics, and he's on the editorial board of several journals. In 2022, he received the Ronald C. Davidson Award for Plasma Physics from the American Institute of Physics. There's no question, this person is a scientist. He knows it. But Dr. Hutchinson is also a person of faith. He has spoken about his faith in dozens of forums, often in a debate format, including a presentation on science, ethics, and religion at a AAAS meeting. I've never, ever spoken at a AAAS meeting. His 2018 book, Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles? And we have 7 more copies left. We had 100 copies. We gave out 93. If you want one afterwards, pick it up. And I'm sure he can sign it for you. His 2018 book, Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles?, tackles hundreds of varied and tough questions that students have asked him at his public presentations. I personally really enjoyed reading his 2011 book called Monopolizing Knowledge, A Scientist Refutes Religion-Denying, Reason-Destroying Scientism. And finally, in all of our conversations and our emails, Ian has made it clear that his goal in coming to Villanova is to help us to build an intellectually strong faith with our students. So there's no question. Here's a person who's deeply thought about faith, deeply cares about faith, and deeply thought about science, and deeply cares about science. He's the perfect person for the Lamb Lecture, and we welcome Dr. Ian Hutchinson, a person of faith and science.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. And let me just say straight away, I hope at the end there'll be lots of good questions, because I always find the questions are the most interesting part of these kinds of events. My intention is to talk about explaining nature naturally. A few years ago, a scientist friend actually, at my church told me about how his son, aged about 9, arrived home from school one day and announced, "I can't be a Christian, Dad, because I want to be a scientist." Our church congregation includes many academic and industrial scientists and engineers, including the boy's own father, who model an unproblematic combination of a sincere Christian faith with a professional life in science. So where did this young person get this idea from? It's possible that a teacher at a public school has made some kind of remark or comment about incompatibility, but there are so many other likely sources in our society, in movies and the internet. This conflict story about science and religion is as much subconsciously absorbed from culture as it is explicitly taught. The anti-theists of this century do loudly promote the story, but some preachers also help to foster it. Their nervousness about what science might imply, for example, about the interpretation of the Bible or the plausibility of Christian morality, leads some of them to promote the idea of conflict, that you have to make a stark choice between believing the Bible or believing what science tells us about the world, and that a real Christian should know where his or her loyalties lie. In this lecture, I'm going to explore a small part of the real historical relationship between science and the Christian faith, asking what it tells about the widespread opinion that science and religion are and always have been at war. As a scientist and a Christian, I want to know what are the real tensions and what are the underlying sources of the simplistic conflict story, which actually is disproved by my own personal experience. So here's a brief outline. I've talked about introducing the conflict story. I'm going to talk about 3 parts of the history since the scientific revolution, and then talk about some personal remarks about how we disentangle this story of the relationship between science and faith. The scientific revolution, so-called, lasted most of the 17th century. Although the solar system of Copernicus was beginning to be taken as a physical reality by a very few philosophers in 1600, there was little sound evidence to support it. And that came only gradually after the newly invented telescope was turned on the heavens by Galileo and others. And although the idea of experiment and observation as the way to a reliable understanding of the natural world wasn't new, ancient authorities like Aristotle still held sway in most universities. And it needed the impulse of practical science, quote, for the relief of man's estate, advocated by Francis Bacon and others, for science as we understand it to begin to emerge. And though the regularities of nature were commonplace, it took most of the century for the idea of natural laws expressed through mathematics to become the ideal, as it was pursued by, for example, Robert Boyle, and achieved for gravity by Isaac Newton. And this brings me to the first observations about the true story of science and faith. The scientific revolution took place in the heart of Christian Europe and was championed and carried forward almost entirely by pioneers who were Christian believers. Both the cultural context and the pioneers' personal faith are of great significance to understanding the relationship between science and faith. The importance for the development of science of the culture's biblical understanding of nature as God's creation has been noted by numerous scholars in the 20th century, and those in the church who resisted it were some who were uneasy about the developing natural philosophy. But to portray the main story as a battle between the clerics' resistance and the free thinking of scientific martyrs, as such popular TV series as Cosmos continue to do, is propaganda, not history. The Christian culture, in fact, provided a fertile, philosophical, and theological intellectual environment in which seminal insights could take root and grow into fully fledged science. Such an environment had been absent in other societies of equal civilization, prosperity, and technology, such as China or India. And early science didn't flourish there. Moreover, the religious faith of early scientists was not, as is often implied, a merely nominal acquiescence in the religious habits of the time. All these people that I just mentioned, and whose portraits I showed, were people of serious personal faith. They expended great efforts to understand Christianity as well as to understand the world. So how could it have been true that at the beginning the Christian religion was at war with science? it wasn't. They were intellectual partners, not enemies. But to be fair, I must mention that even during the 17th century, possible tensions between what was called the experimental philosophy and Christianity were a concern. For example, to Robert Boyle, who was one of the founders of the Royal Society. So in the terminology of 1690, someone who understood and cultivated experimental philosophy was frequently referred to as a virtuoso. And in his book, The Christian Virtuoso, Boyle's intention was to show that, quote, by being addicted to experimental philosophy, a man is rather assisted than indisposed to be a good Christian. And he addresses himself to the puzzlement apparently expressed that he should be both, quote, a diligent cultivator of experimental philosophy and a concerned embracer of the Christian religion. So the question of the compatibility of science and Christianity was, even then, a live one. But the danger that Boyle addressed was less that of a philosophical atheism than it was of a practical atheism, using science to justify their anti-religious preferences. So he says, quote, the profane discourses and the licentious lives of some virtuosi that boast much of the principles of the new philosophy, and I deny not but that if the knowledge of nature falls into the hands of a resolved atheist or a sensual libertine, he may misemploy it to oppugn the grounds or discredit the practice of religion. Didn't they have grandiose ways of expressing themselves in those days? So while Boyle therefore is familiar with those whom he considers, quote, their immorality was the original cause of their infidelity, he says his personal observations make him think that atheists are actually rarer among scientists than is popularly imagined. So he says, and though my conversation has been pretty free in general among naturalists, scientists he means, yet I have met with so few true atheists that I'm apt to think that men's want of due information or their uncharitable zeal has made them mistake or misrepresent many for deniers of God. Calling the 18th century, as we move on through our three eras, the Age of Reason, or simply the Enlightenment, refers to a complicated and diverse fabric of ideas and sentiments that really nobody can crisply define. The intellectual developments of the period were far stronger, actually, in philosophical and political and social studies than they were in natural science. The Enlightenment often justified its developing independence of thought by the success of the scientific revolution. But it was also motivated by a simplistic attribution of the wars and political unrest of the previous century, the 17th century, to traditional and dogma and religious disputation. And so greater tolerance of religious diversity grew, and even in countries where, like Britain, for example, where membership of an established church remained a requirement for various official professions. In European society, the first third of the 18th century was marked, according to the commentators of the day, by licentiousness, drunkenness, dissipation, and a general coarsening of morals. This was accompanied by a relative carelessness of Christian observance and a distaste, even fear, of what was called enthusiasm. Enthusiasm meant, in matters of faith, emotion and personal religious experience, which was regarded by many in society as being rather verging on the fanatical. Despite that distrust, the Methodist awakening, led by George Whitefield and John Wesley, those open-air preachers, had an enormous impact from 1739 onwards in Britain and in America, facing down the disdain of the establishment and emphasizing conversion and a religion of the heart. And that brought widespread personal and social renewal. But here, I want to remain focused on the relationship between Christianity and science. Science understood in the modern sense of the study of the reproducible behavior of the world, the natural world. But I want to warn that it is a mistake to overstate the influence of natural science as such on the evolution of intellectual opinion in the age of reason. Among intellectuals, a key influence that might be justifiably considered a legacy from science was a growing skepticism about the miraculous. The idea that nature was governed by universal mathematical laws led some who followed Newton, but not Newton actually himself, to suppose that divine intervention in the course of nature is simply impossible. The Scottish philosopher David Hume, who was not a scientist, most famously argued this case. And this opinion logically leads to doubt as to the reality of any sort of divine revelation, which itself thoroughly undermines Christian belief. All that was left for those who traveled this intellectual road was deism, the belief in a deity who was responsible for creating the universe, but was thereafter a distant and irrelevant spectator. Deism, however, was not predominant among the scientists themselves. Science's consolidation and gradual growth in the 18th century was punctuated with influential characters of very different perspectives. Among Englishmen, Joseph Priestley, whose researches in chemistry are very well known, embarked on a complicated theological journey from narrow Calvinism to Arian universalism. But he remained a dissenting minister for all but brief periods of his life, even after he emigrated to America, because his English home had been burnt by a mob protesting his support of the French Revolution, by the way. In continental Europe, the antipathy of the French philosophes to the monarchy and to the church is legendary. And certainly there are representatives of that viewpoint, for example, among the authors of the French Encyclopédie, a massive 21-volume work emphasizing science and technology, which many see as the archetype of Enlightenment thought. Its primary editors, Denis Diderot, who discovered nothing in science, and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, who made very, very significant scientific contributions, they were both indeed left-leaning religious skeptics. Nevertheless, Antoine Lavoisier, a noble who was most influential in disproving the phlogiston theory of heat and in discovering oxygen, took the opposite political and religious view, and, by the way, was eventually guillotined for it in the terror of the French Revolution. Elsewhere, Carolus Linnaeus, the father of biological taxonomy, that's where we get all of our Latin descriptions of biological things, was the son of a Swedish Lutheran minister. And the Swiss mathematician Leonhard Euler, whose immense contributions to mathematics included the first formulated equations governing fluid flow, was also a devout Lutheran. And in short, nothing in their Christianity prevented the thinkers of the 18th century from contributing to science. So what about the 19th century? The 19th century brings us to the critical phase of our true story. The apparent determinism of classical physics' descriptions of nature in terms of mechanics gained strength. And despite its philosophically weak underpinnings, the dismissal of miracles had become more influential in the scholarly study of the Bible. At the same time, the evidence was beginning to be persuasive from geology that the Earth was of a great age, far older than the approximately 6,000 years that a literalistic interpretation of the early chapters of Genesis traditionally implied. The older scientific theory of catastrophism, which interpreted geological observations through models of instantaneous creation and then sudden catastrophic changes, sounded more in line with Noah's flood and the rest of Genesis than its scientific rival, which was the emerging uniformitarianism. This new theory explained geological strata, such as the one I'm illustrating, as the result of broadly the same physical processes of erosion and deposition that we see today, except active over eons of time, during which periods of slow uplift of the Earth's crust transformed previously submerged seabeds into mountains. These simultaneous challenges concerning miracles and concerning natural history to biblical authority tended to polarize opinion in the church as well as in science. And just as disputes about Bible interpretation in Galileo's time, in the 1600s, complicated the response to the Copernican implication that the Earth moves around the sun, in contradiction to a naive interpretation of, for example, Psalm 104, quote, "He set the earth on its foundations, it shall never be moved." So it was with the age of the earth and with the ideas of Charles Lyell, the Scottish professor of geology at King's College London, who most influentially championed the now today accepted uniformitarian viewpoint, and who, like Galileo, was a serious Christian. The foreground arguments were about science, but biblical interpretation arguments were an influential background. Moreover, a different problem was brewing that would later in the century break forth into even more divisive controversy. Christian intellectuals had sought justifications of their faith that satisfied the empiricism and growing scientism of their age, of the 19th century. They found what appeared to be an unanswerable rationale in the argument from design, most popularly represented by William Paley's book, Natural Theology, in which he pointed to the enormous diversity and exquisite adaptation of the biological world and proclaimed that, in this at least, nature showed forth beyond any doubt the hand of a designer God. Darwin's Origin of Species, published later in 1859, was a bombshell because it put forward persuasively the scientific case that natural selection and common descent were sufficient natural explanation of diversity and adaptation in the biosphere. And this meant that design could not indubitably be identified in biology. It greatly weakened the biological argument from design that many Christian intellectuals had come to depend on. Once again, though, Christians were divided as to their response. Some, like Harvard professor of botany Asa Gray, found nothing threatening or atheistic about the theory. Others, like his Harvard professorial colleague Louis Agassiz, opposed it in part because of a commitment to the separate creation of each species. And so in America especially, both inside and outside the church, arguments about evolution were fierce. And that, of course, propagated much into the 20th century. At the same time as these events were taking place in the 19th century, towards the end, two related intellectual reorganizations were taking place. One was that science was becoming a profession. Rather than being carried out by natural philosophers whose amateur scientific researches were supported by their own resources or by wealthy patrons, or as a sideline to their regular profession, often as clerics, science was becoming increasingly a full-time job. The other was that universities that had maintained their Christian mission for which they were founded and in which appointments were still being influenced by church regulations began to throw off those constraints, and a secularization of the academy began. It was in the service of this secularization that the myth of the perpetual conflict of science and religion was most strongly promoted. In America, Andrew Dickson White led the charge and eventually published in 1896 the famous book called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. And in it, he gathered and recounted numerous historical examples of areas in which the growth of what he called science encroached upon traditionally religious intellectual territory, initially meeting with stubborn resistance from the entrenched theological power structures, but eventually from sheer force of evidence and argument overthrowing that resistance and moving forward into greater knowledge and enlightenment. The theme is repeated over and over in this rather long book, but it's stirring stuff, complete with martyrs and heroes and villains and intrigues and battles and all the elements that go to make up a good story. Actually, White was for a substantial period the president of the newly founded Cornell University. He and his patron, Ezra Cornell, were determined that their foundation would represent a new model of university in which religious doctrine was to have no place. And White's book, much of whose material he had previously published in pamphlets and other articles, was more a compendium of propaganda in support of the secularization campaign than it was a work of scholarship. And in fact, 20th century historians of science in the last 50 years or so have pointed out its many factual errors and overwhelmingly repudiated its main thesis. Still, the warfare myth persists in the popular mind. White, like many of his contemporaries, used science, the word science, with an enormously wide meaning, so that it encompassed the entirety of liberal scholarship. And so in addition to astronomy and chemistry and geology and other natural sciences, his book has chapters on Egyptology, Assyriology, philology, comparative mythology, economics, and biblical criticism, referring to them all as science and implying that the intellectual methodologies of each are the same. In effect, he was promoting a misleading view that science is all the real knowledge there is. That view, though, is not science, it's scientism. And confusing science with scientism is one of the ongoing influences that keeps the warfare myth alive even today. Well, in the 20th century, and similarly in the 21st, the secularization of the academy, at least beyond the relatively few institutions that maintain their Christian roots, like Villanova perhaps, and the professionalization of science are basically completed. Today, for good or ill, we inherit the results of those two transitions. So let me come now to this last section which I've called disentangling the story, and I've basically tried to represent in this very brief account the strengths and the follies of both sides of complicated and controversial questions. It's simply untrue that history shows the incompatibility of science with the Christian faith, but it's also true that the Christian church has often reacted unwisely towards scientific discoveries in a way that tends to pit science and faith against one another. And I've touched on a few of the key intellectual puzzles in my sketch, but I haven't resolved them. And so for the remainder of my talk, I want to tell how I personally think about these puzzles and reconcile them to my apostolic Christian faith. And the things that I'm specifically going to address are a few thoughts on the authority of the Bible and of science, the age of the earth and scientific natural history, the laws of nature, miracles and determinism, and finally scientism and faith. So, the authority of the Bible and of science. Christianity and the Old and New Testaments have always taught that God reveals himself in two main ways. And the enduring metaphor is that we discover God in two books: the book of God's Word, the Bible, and the book of God's works, nature. And since this is an Augustinian institute, I should just mention that Augustine is the first known author to have used the expression in Latin, the book of nature. Although actually this metaphor goes back even before him, at least to Tertullian, which is, late 2nd century. God's word gathers what is called special revelation, and God's works are the most important of his general revelation of himself to all of humankind. And like Christians down the ages, I believe that, properly interpreted, God's two books are consistent. And I've devoted my career to science because I think that it gives true and deeply significant knowledge. But I also take very seriously the statement in 2 Timothy 3:16 that all Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, reproof, and correction. However, the Bible is an extremely diverse collection of different types of literature. Some of it is history, some is poetry, some prophecy, some theology, some songs, letters, parables, law, ritual, moral teaching, and so on. But one type of literature that is certainly not in the Bible is science as we know it today. Christians were in the forefront of developing those principles of scientific investigation motivated by their belief in a creator God. But nothing in the Bible purports to give what would be recognizable as a scientific description of an experiment or a theory in the manner that we expect in a scientific journal or textbook. So the first principle, I believe, that we ought to bring to understanding the Bible is that it should not be treated as a scientific textbook. Unfortunately, this principle has been disregarded by a substantial number of Christian interpreters as well as by anti-theists. Essentially, no scientist, Christian or not today, sees the Bible as a source book from which to derive the specifics of science. Science's reliance instead is on repeatable experiments and observations. That reliance developed in a manner that required a break with scholasticism's reliance on ancient written authorities. Yet, philosophical and theological viewpoints are relevant to science and have influenced its development. And the biblical worldview, as I said, was a fertile climate in which science as we know it today first flourished. So, to find out about the natural world, we should go to the book of God's works, not because it's inconsistent with his word, properly interpreted, but because his works are glorious and revealing in themselves. And when there appears to be some inconsistency between those two books, I conclude that the problem lies in the interpretation either of science or of the Scripture. I observe that the Bible being inspired doesn't guarantee that its interpretation is correct. I don't believe there is such a thing as a totally literal reading of any text, because all language requires interpretation, depending upon metaphor and other figures of speech. So when the Bible, or anyone else for that matter, talks about the sun rising, we don't immediately jump to correct that error and say, no, it's really the earth rotating. Nobody speaks totally literally or reads the Bible literally. Or when Jesus says in John chapter 15, I am the true vine, is he saying that he's a creeping plant with green leaves? Well, no, of course not. It would be silly to mistake it in that way and interpret literally. Interpretation sometimes is uncertain, so we should have some humility about it. And we should use the two books to help interpret each other rather than pitting them against one another. Okay, the age of the earth. I've already alluded to one example of the tension that arises from reading the Bible as if it were science. The age of the earth and the 6 days of creation. To suppose that the first chapter of Genesis is meant to document scientifically the creation is a total anachronism. Regardless of science, even the early church fathers recognized the internal inconsistencies of a literalistic interpretation like that and offered figurative interpretations. And today, the scientific evidence for the gradual development over many hundreds of millions of years of the geological strata and the bacteria, plant and animal species from simple beginnings has reached a point where no reputable scientist disputes the overall picture. All of geology, backed up by physics techniques such as radioactive dating, physical cosmology, the field of biology itself with modern knowledge of the genome, tells us that the Earth is over 4 billion years old and the universe is 13.8 billion years. These scientific facts are in contradiction with an interpretation of the 6 days of Genesis 1 as literally 24-hour periods. But that shouldn't cause Christians alarm. The purpose of Genesis, as it spoke to those early Hebrews, was not to tell them how God created the world, but that he created it. It was to make crystal clear that their God was not a tribal deity like those of the peoples that surrounded them, that the one God is the creator of everything. I mean, perhaps that seems too obvious to us today because we have behind us millennia of monotheism to look back on. But it was not obvious to them, and it remains an important reminder of God's sovereignty to us too. Okay, universal law. A familiar skeptical argument runs like this. Long ago, people didn't understand the workings of the natural world, and many things seemed to them miraculous. But now science has shown that the world is governed by inviolable universal laws, so it's impossible to believe in miracles. Well, let's not dwell on the fact that people in ancient times were actually well aware in a practical way of the consistent working of nature, so they didn't think that most phenomena were miraculous, even if they didn't understand the causes. But instead, let's ponder the idea of laws of nature. Laws of nature, which certainly was an important concept introduced by science. One point to note immediately is that the idea of laws of nature originally referred to, in direct analogy with human laws, to the dictates of a lawgiver. It would be strange to suppose that a human law could be inviolable. If it were impossible to break such a law, it would be entirely unnecessary to formulate it. Human laws are there to discourage and punish actions that are possible but undesirable. Human laws are intrinsically violable. The idea of nature governed by universal law is sometimes called Newtonian science. Actually, Isaac Newton himself thought, incorrectly as it turns out, that God on occasion had to correct small perturbations of the orbits of the planets in contradiction of his own laws. So historically, successful science did not require the laws of nature to be inviolable. Okay? Still, the remarkable success of science's description of nature does show that the laws of physics are obeyed pretty much all the time. All of our technology depends upon physical laws and works amazingly reliably. And the issue, therefore, boils down to whether pretty much all the time or amazingly reliably really means an absolute without fail. If it did, then one might conclude that a miracle that breaks the laws of physics is impossible. And Christianity is perhaps more than most other religions a faith that it is based upon the miraculous intervention of God in history. If miracles are impossible, then maybe Christianity is in trouble. So that's the puzzle. My response to this challenge, which is developed in much more detail in the book, but I don't have time to do it now, is this, in outline. First of all, science seeks to understand the world insofar as it behaves repeatably, following natural laws, number one. Successful science only requires amazingly reliable and not without fail behavior and cannot distinguish between them. 3, there are aspects of the world that don't behave reproducibly and so can't be investigated by the methods of science. 4. Miracles are intrinsically unreproducible events, which science therefore is incompetent to prove or disprove. 5. I've seen some remarkable events in my own life which I interpret as extraordinary acts of God, regardless of whether they are contrary to the normal working of nature. But a related issue is determinism that's often brought up by the anti-theists of this century. The equations governing physics are deterministic in the sense that, given initial conditions, one can in principle solve them and determine future behavior. And if the universe is deterministic, then how could God act in it? Actually, for that matter, how can humans act in it? Because basically, if they're just wetware following deterministic equations. Doesn't determinism undermine virtually all of the teachings of Christianity and most religions? My response is that this critique might have seemed serious in the context of 19th century classical physics, but physics has changed. 20th century chaos theory shows that even classical equations are not as soluble as was once thought, and quantum uncertainty means that though our equations might be deterministic, the universe is not completely described by them. Physical determinism is therefore not implied by today's laws of physics. Instead, there's an openness about outcomes in the real world. Okay, well, beyond the historical myth of perpetual conflict between science and religion, and beyond the tensions about specific principles of science and their compatibility with a biblical faith, there is in our culture this embracing climate of opinion that underwrites the declaration of my friend's son. I can't be a Christian dad because I want to be a scientist. And that influence is most notably scientism. Scientism is the excessive reliance on science, the belief that the totality of human knowledge comes from following the methods of the natural sciences. The reductionist view that when we know the component parts of something and their interactions, we know all there is to know. This view, influential though it may be, is, in my opinion, a ghastly intellectual error. At the very least, I draw attention to the fact that this lecture has been almost entirely history and not science. Though science gives true knowledge, knowing the truth requires much more than science and must be pursued in all of our diverse intellectual endeavor. But what about faith? I've hardly touched on it in this talk so far, but I need to, however briefly, given the time. The word faith has 3 strands of meaning: belief in propositions, trust in a personal thing, and loyalty to a personal principle. And those who denigrate faith usually focus on the idea that belief without or against evidence is what faith is. But faith is belief and consistent action sustained by evidence, however incomplete, even in the face of uncertainty or adversity. And in that sense, faith is an integral part of science, as it is of all of our understanding. And when it comes to the Christian faith, it is the second and third meanings, trust and loyalty, that are the most important. Trust and loyalty, not just correct intellectual concepts or doctrinal purity, are what sustain individual Christians in their spiritual life. Trust and loyalty are developed by spiritual disciplines of worship, prayer, fellowship, Bible study, and service. They help us to know God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, not just to know about God. That personal acquaintance encompasses the whole of life, not just the intellect. And that sort of faith was what sustained Jesus' disciples and eventually changed the world. And it has sustained saints both celebrated and unknown of history and of today. So I want to close my lecture with a quotation from one of the most celebrated scientists of the 20th century, Arthur Stanley Eddington. He was the discoverer of galaxies and of the internal physical structure of the stars. And he put the idea of personal faith like this. In the case of our human friends, we take their existence for granted. We could read philosophical arguments designed to prove the non-existence of each other, and perhaps even be convinced by them, and then laugh together over so odd a conclusion. I think that it is something of the same kind of security we should seek in our relationship with God. Christianity stands up to intellectual scrutiny and can welcome true scientific knowledge. It makes intellectual sense, and serious evidence supports its truthfulness. But I agree with Eddington that a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ is ultimately the way we know and trust him. Thank you very much for listening.